Good morning. Today is, let's see, December 20th. It's Tuesday. And this morning I'm going to talk quickly about something that's been in the news over the last few days. And it's also something everybody should be very, very concerned about. A few years ago, when the conflict in Syria began with the rebels trying to overthrow the Assad regime, the rebels within the country, the Syrian people who were rising up against the Assad government, there were concerns raised that some of the fighters coming in might be terrorists, members of Al-Qaeda or the Al-Nusra Front, and that sort of thing. Turns out they were. And what's happened is that slowly over the last couple of years, basically most of the legitimate rebels that were fighting Assad and trying to change the government there have been pushed aside and replaced by members of various terrorist groups, most notably the Al-Nusra Front, who are a violent, very dangerous group of Sunni Muslims. And they have, as many of you know, taken over the city of Aleppo, or took it over. And we're using the Shiite population there basically as human shields and putting them in great jeopardy and danger and executing them and doing all kinds of things. And over the weekend, a report came out by a Canadian journalist, a woman, a Western woman, who actually lives in Gaza. She's very familiar with Arab culture and Muslim culture. And she had a very interesting interview. And if you haven't heard it, you really need to listen to this. You really need to hear it and then do your own homework and find out where the news is coming from and what kind of news we're getting that's being reported in the Western media about the conflict in Syria. And we're going to take a quick look at that video right here. And this is the video. If you have seen it, okay, skip ahead. But if you haven't seen it, I urge you to listen to this. It's very important.
When you talk about the Syrian people and what the Syrian people want, how can you quantify that? Do you have any independent surveys where you can actually document that? And secondly, you talk about the corporate media, the Western media, the lies, and all of this. Could you explain what you think might be the agenda from us in the Western media, and why we should lie, why the international organizations on the ground should lie, why we shouldn't believe all these absolutely documentable facts that we see from the ground, these hospitals being bombed, these civilians who are talking about the atrocities that they have been experiencing. How can you justify calling all of us liars?
Sure.
Thank you.
I mean, there are certainly honest journalists amongst the very compromised establishment media. Let's start with your second question. So, international organizations on the ground. Tell me which ones are on the ground in eastern Aleppo. Yeah, okay, I'll tell you, there are none. There are none. These organizations are relying on the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in Coventry, UK, and which is one man. They're relying on compromised groups like the White Helmets, which, let's talk about the White Helmets. The White Helmets were founded in 2013 by a British ex-military officer. They have been funded to the tune of $100 million by the US, UK, and Europe, and other states. They purport to be rescuing civilians in eastern Aleppo and Idlib, yet no one in eastern Aleppo has heard of them. And I say no one, bearing in mind that now 95% of these areas of eastern Aleppo are liberated. The White Helmets purport to be neutral, yet they can be found carrying guns and standing on the dead bodies of Syrian soldiers. And their video footage actually contains children that have been recycled in different reports. So you can find a girl named Aya who turns up in a report in month, say, August, and she turns up in the next month in 2 different locations. So they are not credible. The SOHR is not credible. Unnamed activists are not credible. Once or twice maybe, but every time, not credible.
And she goes on from there and just basically eviscerates everything you've been hearing about reports from this area. And it is true that nearly all of it is coming from either the White Helmets or the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. And if anybody bothers to go and look up to see who this human rights organization is, SOHR it's called, you come up with this this is back in 2012. And it's basically a fake organization that was established by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who's an ex-Syrian who's been living in England for about 15 years. He has a very elaborate website, and it is a totally one-man operation. There's nothing there other than putting out data and stories and reports by unverified sources, and he's basically about the most discreditable person out there. But his organization sounds very formal. Sounds like it's almost part of the UN. It's not. It's privately funded. He is a Sunni activist. He despises the Assad government, and that's fine. Go for regime change. But he is supporting, and he has supported and argued on behalf of not only Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra Front, who are the primary fighters in Syria today. This is not the Syrian people. The Syrian people are not the primary rebels any longer. They haven't been for some time. As the U.S. was so concerned when the war began, they have been replaced. They've been replaced with imported fighters from various radical groups, and they are the occupiers now of, or were the occupiers of Aleppo. And here's another article that appeared about this guy back in April of 2013. And how it was basically, here he is, it was basically a clearinghouse for propaganda. It's basically a propaganda machine that was given credibility. His name is Abdul Rahman. And the New York Times and all these papers constantly quote him. And nobody ever says, well, where's your information come from? And on the rare occasion that it's been asked, he says he has people inside that he can't discuss or anything like this. And then you have White Helmets. Now, White Helmets is a big, heavily funded organization. As the lady mentioned, they have gotten $100 million from Western governments to portray the war in Syria in a certain light, and they've been caught making fake news videos, fake rescues of people. They use flour, they use red paint, all this other stuff, and they've been caught doing it, and they've actually tried to justify why they do it. The people in eastern Aleppo have, so far, nobody's ever heard of these guys there. And they use videos from other attacks, other news stories, and they recycle stories. As was mentioned, a girl named Aya was repeatedly used in assorted news and press releases by White Helmets. They have no credibility, and yet the New York Times is constantly quoting them. It's amazing. And then we get over here, we saw no evidence of executions in Syria as reported by the White Helmets in mainstream media. Bear in mind, the mainstream media is getting the reports from White Helmets or SOHR, all right? And this was an RT, and I know a lot of people don't like RT because it's Russian, but I would urge you to go back and read some of their older stories and then check ahead to see how accurate they've been. They are remarkably accurate. Okay, and the Americans have to get over this idea that if it's not in the New York Times, it's not legitimate. You might start thinking of it in opposite terms. And here's another article that appeared on the Alternate by Gareth Porter in November of this year, talking about the White Helmets and how they basically spin the media, make up stories to go along with the agenda. And in here they talk about how they get all this money from the West to portray the war in such a way that makes the U.S. look good and makes everybody else look bad. And here's one that came out very recently, and you may have heard about some buses being burned during the evacuation. And what sort of got skimmed over in the New York Times and all this, these buses weren't burned by the Assad regime. The Russians in the Assad regime provided the buses to evacuate Shiites out of eastern Aleppo. And there are 200 or so, 200 or 300 of these former Al-Nusra Front terrorists living there that were using the Syrians as human shields. And what happened was when they brought the buses in to evacuate the people and get them out of there, Al-Nusra, this group, this Al-Sham group, didn't like it. They set the buses on fire, and they further became enraged when they weren't being allowed to bring their weapons with them because they were among the evacuees. They were being evacuated. All right. They set the buses on fire, and they don't deny it. All right. And then we get over to this story. This appeared in Al Jazeera. All right, Syrian rebels blame Russia for stalled talks in Aleppo. Well, the stalled talks had to do with the fact that the terrorists on the ground in eastern Aleppo weren't cooperating. They wouldn't even negotiate directly. They would only do it through the Turkish government. And the Turks don't agree with the Russians on a lot of things, but they're at least talking. And there's a story in here about those 200 fighters from Jabhat Fateh Al-Sham, and they formerly members of Al-Nusra, and it goes into it. And this group, now this is a group the United States and the West are supporting. These are the people that are supposed to be the liberators, and yet, according to the U.S. State Department and the Russians, they both call this group a terrorist organization. The sad part is the Russians aren't supporting them, and we are. It's ironic. We're fighting to arguing that they should be taking over and toppling the Assad regime on one side, and yet we're attacking ISIS on the other, and the Russians are fighting both groups. It's a mess. Now here's a case that goes back. Remember the gas attacks? Well, the Syrian rebels, those people that we're supporting, have admitted in the Kurdish press that they were the ones that did use the gas that was in the news a short time ago. All right, the rebel groups had captured a former Assad chemical weapons dump and weapons factory. They destroyed the factory, but they kept all the raw materials. And here you can read about how they went ahead and made their own chemical weapons and put them in bombs and dropped them all over the Kurds. Now remember, the Kurds are supposed to be, helping topple the Assad government. These guys are terrorists, okay? They're fighting everybody. And here's more on it. There's another article in this same Kurdish paper about the terrorist attacks and violations of human rights using gas and other weapons and bombarding civilian neighborhoods. All right? And that's what's going on. So we have a case right now where the United States has found itself stuck supporting some very bad people who are terrorists. After all the legitimate rebels have left, they've left us holding the bag with these guys, and we're getting propped up in the media by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a phony organization, and the White Helmets, a really big phony organization. And that's what's happening today. And I would urge everybody to take a look at their media and look at where they're getting their news. And of course, in other news today, we're talking about we have the assassination of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. He was killed by a radical, pro-terrorist guy who's a cop. He'd gone off the deep end. And of course, we had the attack in Berlin yesterday by apparently a Sunni Muslim who went off the deep end and drove a truck through a Christmas celebration, killing 12 people and injuring 50 more, reminiscent of the attack in Paris last year. These are Sunnis, and we're supporting a very dangerous Sunni faction right now in the Syrian war. All right, so do your homework. And don't believe one damn thing you get out of the local media if it quotes any of these organizations. Thanks. Bye.